Folks, I think it's time that we should begin. If everyone could get settled. As David mentioned earlier, my name is Father Bill Miscamble, and I have the honor of teaching in the great Department of History here at Notre Dame. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to chair this session this evening, and I thank David Solomon and Dan McInerney for inviting me to do so. Before introducing our speaker, Elizabeth Schiltz, I want to say some words about a truly good man for whom our lecture is named, as David mentioned downstairs, John C., or we knew him as Jack Schuster. Jack died 3 years ago on November the 1st, All Saints' Day, of course, in the Catholic calendar. And just a few short days before his death, Jack, along with his wife, Silva, who's seated right there, attended this conference. And that year's theme was Joy in the Truth, the Catholic University in the New Millennium. I remember so well, and you may recall, Silva, Jack engaging in discussion in a session in which I was involved with a young woman and in giving her encouragement about pursuing her true calling and vocation. And this was literally just weeks before his death. It was an example of, and a testimony to, this man's love for ideas and intellectual exchange. He had supported the work of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture during his life, and we're very grateful to you, Silva, for your generosity, which makes possible this lecture named for Jack, which will be an important part of what is such a distinctive conference. Jack Schuster was a man who treasured faith and family and friendship and learning, and of course also the University of Notre Dame, from which he graduated in 1961. And we're rather hoping that all ND grads, long into the future, will treasure faith and family and friendship and learning. Jack was a brilliant and talented man who enjoyed success in the field of banking and investment. And as we learned downstairs, it's very appropriate that Elizabeth, who's sort of a bit of an expert in banking law, is giving the talk here tonight. Jack was a person of integrity and insight and good judgment. I can only imagine his comments on the financial crisis we have witnessed over this past month or so. I rather wish he were around to help clean up some of the mess. Jack Schuster tried to live his life in accord with the Golden Rule. Through honestly facing challenges and limitations in his own life, he came to recognize his need for God's grace, to appreciate that he couldn't, despite his brilliance, could not do it all. So as to live fully his Christian life. He was devoted to his wife and to his children and to his extended family. He had for children and feel privileged in his friends, and others of them are here tonight, seated there with Silva. Jack was a generous and wise man who reached out to many others to give them support and encouragement in living well. He truly understood what matters most. He knew that a life well lived, a life reflecting love of God and neighbor, lives on through the people one meets and touches and loves. I mentioned earlier that Jack loved learning, and he was in his element discussing ideas and critiquing books and arguments and engaged in dialogue and conversation, which he truly loved. And I think he would be deeply glad that a lecture is named for him, knowing that it will be the starting point for further conversation and discussion. That would please him greatly. I also think he would be deeply pleased that the inaugural Jack Schuster Memorial Lecture will be delivered by a creative and courageous and deeply thoughtful Catholic intellectual. Professor Elizabeth Schiltz teaches law, including banking law, at the University of St. Thomas School of Law in Minneapolis. She was a philosophy major at Yale, but we won't hold that against her. She took her law degree at Columbia University School of Law. She worked at a couple of impressive law firms and then taught here at Notre Dame Law School before moving to St. Thomas, I think in 2001. St. Thomas's gain was Notre Dame's loss. I won't engage in a lengthy listing of all Elizabeth's publications and presentations and honors. If you want that, you can write to her and ask for her CV. But I think it's fair to say that Elizabeth has been wrestling over a number of years with some subjects which are central to the theme of our conference this year, dedicated to the family, searching for fairest love. Just consider these titles from some of her recent or forthcoming articles. Quote, "Should bearing the child mean bearing all the cost? Question mark. A Catholic perspective on the sacrifice of motherhood and the common good." Another article, "Restructuring the workplace to accommodate family life." Another, "Learning from Mary, the feminine vocation and American law." Elizabeth is presently working in an area which might be a book, might be articles. It's in this area of complementarity, the philosophical case for Catholic feminism. And obviously she draws her lecture tonight from that work. The title of her lecture, I'm sure, has had some of you wondering, what the hell is this about? It's titled, "Does Sarah plus John?" I haven't heard those names recently. Have you heard of Sarah lately? Does Sarah and John equal 3? The history and future of complementarity in Catholic feminism. Please welcome the inaugural Jack Schuster Memorial Lecturer, Professor Elizabeth R. Schiltz.
Father Miss Campbell probably doesn't remember this, but I first met him at a big conference in Rome. It was at the Vatican. And there was a big auditorium full of cardinals giving talks. And at one of these, one of the cardinals, and I blotted out, fortunately, his name or where he was from, gave a talk that was basically very hostile towards America. We were basically, I think, blamed for everything from global warming to, Britney Spears. And the Americans in the audience were feeling, we didn't know what to do after he finished. And Father Miss Campbell stands up and in this broad Australian accent defended the honor of the United States of America. And I felt at that time sort of like, I think, like a kid in an alley, being beat up by the bullies and having Superman swoop down. So those of you who know Father Miss Campbell better than I probably think of him, when you think of him, you see him in your mind's eye, wearing his Roman collar. I see him wearing blue tights and a red cape. Anyway. I have to begin, though, by saying that it is an incredible honor to be the inaugural speaker in the Jack Schuster Memorial Lecture Series. I wish I had known Jack, and I am so grateful that I have had the opportunity to meet Silva, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I also want to thank David Solomon and Daniel McInerney and Elizabeth Kirk and the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture for this honor and the opportunity to talk to you all tonight. I also have to take just a minute to express my gratitude to the institution of the University of Notre Dame, too. As Father Miss Campbell said, I began my teaching career here at the law school in 1995, and I was fresh out of private practice with my husband and I were both hired. Here at Notre Dame is where I started to learn how to be an academic, and I learned that being an academic is really a wonderful job. But I could have learned that at any number of universities. Here at Notre Dame, I learned two things. There were two things that were available to me that are available at very, very few universities. One of them is that I was hired as a part-time tenure-track teacher. The ability to work in a part-time tenure track was an incredible gift to me. I was pregnant with my third child when I started here, and for 5 years I was given the enormous privilege of being able to work part-time but still stay on the tenure track. I've researched this, I've written about it. Part-time tenure track positions are very, very rare in academia. Notre Dame keeps company with many of the top-ranked secular universities in doing so, but unfortunately it's almost alone among Catholic universities in this regard. I know that many incredible women are able to balance family and tenure track successfully, but I would not have been one of them. So I'll always be eternally grateful for the extraordinary support that I received here at Notre Dame that let me stay in academia and give my family the attention that it needed. The second unique gift that I was given by starting my academic career here at Notre Dame was that it was here that I started to learn what it means to take seriously your identity as a Catholic academic. As a Catholic academic, this job, as wonderful as it is, it's more than just a job. It's a vocation. It's a calling. And if you follow the call of that vocation, you will find yourself sometimes led to strange, utterly unexpected places and sometimes rather scary places, like me standing here in front of you all tonight, preparing to give a talk about Catholic feminism that's going to involve a lot of philosophy and even some theology. And I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a theologian, I'm a banking regulatory law professor. But I am also a Catholic woman. And as a Catholic woman, I am one of the people who our beloved Pope John Paul II directly called in his famous paragraph 99 of Evangelium Vitae, to work on articulating a new feminism. So what you'll be hearing from me tonight is part of my attempt as a Catholic laywoman to use the resources of philosophy and theology as presented to me by philosophers and theologians whose job it is to understand these things much more deeply than I ever will, to construct a workable Catholic feminism, a framework for working through the practical issues of law and social policy that we all as citizens have to work through in life. I suspect that many of you have some ambivalence about the very idea of Catholic feminism. I suspect that many of you, like me, spend a lot of your years of intellectual formation avoiding conventional feminist theory. Like me, I suspect that many of you, for many of you, your deeply rooted Catholic pro-life and pro-family views have kept you at somewhat of a distance from the currents of thought of feminist theory. For me, as a college student and later as a professional, the pro-choice entry ticket was a prohibitive barrier to feminist circles. Despite this lack of identification with most feminist groups, though, I also suspect that many of you, like me, have never considered yourselves as anything but a feminist. I was raised in a traditional Polish-American Catholic family. My father had a job outside the home. My mother raised their 6 children. But for all its traditional trappings, the family environment in which I was raised simply assumed very empowered women. My parents had no doubt that the work that my mother was doing in keeping our family together and functioning was every bit as valuable a contribution to the family unit and to the world as the work that my father was doing outside of the home. Both of my parents were raised by mothers who had even larger families, 13 and 11 kids, and who also contributed significantly to the outside-the-home labor that kept those families going. My paternal grandmother on their farm and my maternal grandmother working as a cleaning lady in office buildings to support her family during the Depression. Even the Catholic female images that held the tightest sway over our childhood imaginations growing up were very empowered women. My father in particular was devoted to the iconic image of the Black Madonna of Częstochowa, the icon which, according to legend, was painted by St. Luke the Evangelist on the cypress tabletop from the home of the Holy Family, right? The Black Madonna is credited with miraculously saving the monastery of Jasna Góra from a 17th century invasion of Poland by the Swedes in a battle that changed the course of the war and led King Jan Kazimierz to crown Our Lady of Częstochowa as the Queen and Protector of Poland. When my sister and I were choosing our confirmation saints, we fought over who got Bernadette of Lourdes, a frail young girl, yes, but no slouch when it came to standing up to ecclesial authorities, or Joan of Arc, the peasant who led the French army to victory over the English in the 100 Years' War. I got Joan of Arc. I don't think that my experiences in this regard are all that unique. I suspect that many Catholic women grew up surrounded by similarly empowered models of femininity, both the women who raised them and the saints they were offered as examples of Catholic spirituality. I think that this lived experience leads many Catholic women to naturally embrace feminism, at least as defined by the Catholic philosopher Sister Prudence Allen. An organized way of thought and action that gives special attention to removing obstacles to the full development of women. However, the insistent identification of traditional feminist theory with pro-choice policies has caused many Catholic women to either reject or deny the Catholic underpinnings of their feminism or the feminist underpinnings of their Catholicism. But I think that more of us are beginning to find the courage, or maybe it's just the time, to try to reconcile the two. And I know that many Catholic women are finding that courage and making that time in direct response to the call of the late Pope John Paul II. In that oft-cited paragraph 99 of his encyclical, Evangelium Vitae, he issues this clarion challenge. I have it on my wall. I read it a lot. In transforming culture so that it supports life, women occupy a place in thought and action which is unique and decisive. It depends on them to promote a new feminism, which rejects the temptation of imitating models of male domination in order to acknowledge and affirm the true genius of women in every aspect of the life of society, and overcome all discrimination, violence, and exploitation. So what I'm going to do in my talk tonight is offer an explanation of what I consider to be the basic foundation of this new Catholic feminism. It's the concept of complementarity. This is a theory that, as I will explain, leads to the conclusion that, as I suggest in the title of my talk, Sarah plus John equals 3. This conclusion has both philosophical and theological dimensions. Complementarity is a theory of gender relations positing that men and women are both significantly different and fundamentally equal. It rejects many of the alternative theories of gender relations underlying contemporary secular feminism, that there are no significant differences between men and women, or that the only differences between men and women are socially constructed rather than biologically based. As a Catholic concept of gender identity, complementarity results from taking seriously our conviction that we are all created in the image and likeness of God, and that there's something significant about the fact about God that's revealed in the fact that He chose to make some of us men and some of us women. Taking this question seriously, I believe, helps us understand why Sarah plus John equals 3, not 1 or 2, and why it will take men and women working together in their uniquely and significantly different ways to create something truly new, namely the culture of life here on earth. I'm going to begin with a description of the philosophical foundations of this concept, relying really rather heavily on the groundbreaking work on the history of the philosophy of gender by the Catholic philosopher Sister Prudence Allen. I will offer an account of the evolution of the concept of complementarity as a philosophical theory largely developed through the work of a succession of philosophers who happen to be Catholic. The historical evolution of this concept is influenced by some points of Catholic theology, much of it articulated in the past 20 years, most particularly by Pope John Paul II. After I discuss its history, I'm going to spend some time on its future. If we are to embrace complementarity as a foundational concept for new feminism and develop it and foster its widespread acceptance, how do we do that and what difference would it make? I will end with a couple of examples ripped from the headlines of the past few weeks of what a difference the embrace of complementarity might actually make in our world. And, because I know, y'all don't think I just randomly chose the name Sarah and John in my title, the last of these examples is going to involve a few thoughts about how the various reactions to Sarah Palin's nomination as Vice President illustrate the very real challenges facing new feminism and its foundational concept, complementarity, in today's world, and the very real difference that it might make. Okay, history, the past. I think, as I've mentioned, the most insightful contemporary Catholic thinker about complementarity is Sister Prudence Allen. She's a philosophy professor at St. John Vianney's Theological Seminary in Denver, Colorado. Sister Allen has published what's still only a 2-volume set called The Concept of Woman, exploring in great depth the history of philosophical thinking about women in the Western world. She spent over 30 years working on this. Volume 1 covers the Aristotelian Revolution from 750 BC to AD 1250. Volume 2 covers the early humanist Reformation, 1250 to 1500. I've heard that she has finally finished Volume 3 and it's going to get us up to the present day. Fortunately for us, though, in the meantime, she's also written a number of articles about complementarity since the 1500s. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be drawn from those articles. Beginning at the very beginning, though, from her book, Sister Allen traces 3 basic philosophic theories of gender identity over the past 3,000 years. One of them is a unisex view first articulated by Plato. This view rejects significant differentiation between men and women while defending their basic equality. The second is the polarity position, first articulated by Aristotle. This view accepts significant gender differentiation, but rejects equality, instead positing a natural superiority of men over women. Allen traces the swings back and forth between these two positions over the course of the centuries to contemporary thought, which embraces both anti-religious secular humanism that gravitates toward the unisex position and postmodern radical feminism that vacillates between reverse gender polarity that exalts women over men and a deconstruction of gender differentiation altogether. Through this weaving back and forth, though, between these two extremes, Allen demonstrates is a third view, a view that she argues is based on Christian theological and philosophical foundations and was largely developed by Catholic philosophers. This is the principle of gender complementarity, which embraces both fundamental equality and significant differentiation between men and women. Allen argues that the groundwork for this view was laid by Augustine of Hippo, Hildegard of Bingen, and Thomas Aquinas, each through different contributions to the concept of gender complementarity. Allen characterizes Augustine as generally holding a fragmented view of gender identity, vacillating between unity and polarity for different purposes. But she argues that Augustine contributed to the development of complementarity by decisively rejecting the Aristotelian view that the woman's body is an imperfect version of the ideal male body, arguing instead, in connection with his convictions on the resurrection of the body, that both men and women will be resurrected in perfect male and female bodies. Allen characterizes the 12th century philosopher Hildegard of Bingen as the foundress of the philosophy of sex complementarity. She characterizes her as the first Western philosophy to articulate a complete concept of sex complementarity, integrating the rational, material, and spiritual aspects of human nature into a unified whole. Hildegard suggests that this philosophical breakthrough in theories of gender identity was possible, Allen suggested it was possible for Hildegard because of the environment in which she was educated. A double monastery in which, for the first time in history, men and women were studying philosophy together. Unlike us here tonight, right? She concludes that one central factor in the preparation for a philosophy of sex complementarity is the actual experience of men and women jointly participating in the practice of philosophy. Thomas Aquinas' contribution to complementarity is a little bit more complex. On the one hand, he embraced and indeed revitalized Aristotelian notions of sex polarity, positing women as inferior to men with regard to aspects of human nature related to the physical body, including also the ability to reason and to be virtuous. On the other hand, though, Aquinas rejected this conclusion as a theological matter. Instead, he found some theological significance in the differences between men and women, arguing that just as a variety in the grading of things contributes to the perfection of a universe, so the variety of sex makes for perfection of human nature. According to Allen now, this is a quote from Allen about Aquinas, Aquinas recognized that in heaven it was not possible to speak of man as superior to woman. At the same time, he believed that it was also necessary, through the integral relation of body and soul, to insist on the significant differentiation between men and women. Allen thus argues that Aquinas set the stage, making it possible for us to build on that theological foundation of sex complementarity, and on the Thomistic hylomorphism, and that's what we call, right, this integral relation of body and soul, that's hylomorphism, to forge a new philosophy of sex identity. This Thomistic affirmation of the unity of body and soul, this hylomorphism, contrasted sharply with a Cartesian separation of the sexless mind from the gendered body that underlay the development of many Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment secular philosophical movements dealing with gender relations. Complementarity builds upon insights from two of these post-Enlightenment philosophical movements that rejected this duality, phenomenology and personalism. And we'll talk about both of them. Phenomenology first. The development of the concept of complementarity began with two Catholic philosophers who were students of Edmund Husserl. Husserl is one of the founders of phenomenology, the founder of phenomenology. It's a philosophical movement that emphasizes first-person experiences of things as the starting point for philosophical inquiry. These two students were Dietrich von Hildebrand and Edith Stein. Both of them argued that the differences between men and women are more than merely biological. They are metaphysical. According to Hildebrand, the distinction between men and women shows us two complementary types of the spiritual person of the human species. Stein turned to a renewed Thomistic metaphysics, and this is quoting Allen again, affirming the unity of the body, soul-body composite, and argued that the soul has priority in gender differentiation. The Thomistic metaphysical foundation for the ontological unity of the human person was joined by Stein to a phenomenological analysis to uncover the essence of the lived experience of the body in men and women. According to Stein, women's lived experiences in their female bodies naturally orient them towards supporting new life within their bodies, whether or not they ever actually experience physical motherhood. And men's lived experiences in their male bodies naturally orient them toward detachment of seed as fathers, whether or not they ever actually experience physical fatherhood. This different experience of what life is orients men and women to perceiving and receiving the world differently. What these insights do for us as Catholic men and women trying to articulate a gender theory is, in essence, I would argue, validate many of our most fundamental instincts that are specifically questioned by secular feminists. For example, consider the theory of the relationships between men and women that's depicted by the radical Marxist feminist Catherine MacKinnon. MacKinnon argues that relationships between men and women are inevitably shaped by socially constructed forces aimed at perpetuating men's power over women. She understands feminism as analogous to Marxism, both of which critique the oppression of a powerless group of people, women or workers, by the powerful, men, or the owners of the means of production. MacKinnon argues that our notion of sexuality is a tool used by men to perpetuate their domination over women. Our notions of gender are artificially created social constructs that serve to channel human sexual desire into forms that perpetrate the subjugation of women. The only way for women to free themselves from this subjugation is to recognize that what they perceive as natural, the seemingly elemental force of sexual desire, is actually a tool of their oppression. They are thus urged to filter all their thoughts, reactions, responses through the lens of suspicion of men and of what they perceive as their own natural instincts with respect to men. Now just contrast this with the theory of relationships between men and women that's depicted by the Catholic theologian Robert Joyce. Joyce argues that relationships between men and women are based on a fundamental intuitive appreciation of human sexuality as the personal power to share the gift of self with one another. This power is expressed and felt on all levels of a human's being, physical, psychic, spiritual. If we heed our intuitions, we recognize that this power is expressed and felt differently in men and in women, and that those differences reflect, according to Joyce, two complementary dimensions of the activity of giving and receiving. Joyce attributes the oppression of women in the modern world to a Western cultural bias against the receiving part of any activity, the part of human sharing that is most natural to the woman rather than the man. He argues that women will be treated more fairly when society reevaluates that cultural bias. So this very brief summary of those two contrasting positions reveals a fundamentally different attitude about how much trust we can place in our own lived experiences. Although I'm fairly certain MacKinnon would reject this idea, it seems to me that the difference in orientation is perhaps one of the unfortunate intellectual consequences of the Protestant Reformation. MacKinnon's argument is based predominantly on evidence of social pathologies, the predominance of violent sexual crimes such as rape and spousal abuse and pornography. It is fundamentally rooted in the sinful nature of man, literally in this case of men, right? It seems to me to reflect a more Protestant conception of the human nature and reason as something inevitably obscured and clouded. Accepting her argument means accepting that we fundamentally misperceive something as elemental to human experience as sexual desire. In contrast, Joyce's argument is based predominantly on the lived experience of healthy, functioning bodies. Accepting his argument means accepting that our perceptions and intuitions about this can provide us access to the truth. In a few minutes, I'll return to this notion, exploring how John Paul II integrated this fundamentally Catholic faith in what we can learn from our lived experiences into his work on complementarity. But before I do that, I want to consider the influence of the other philosophical movement, personalism. The next step in the evolution of the notion of complementarity, according to Allen, was its explication by the proponents of the school of personalism, Jacques and Raissa Maritain, Emmanuel Mounier, and Gabriel Marcel. They developed personalism as a Christian version of existentialism. For personalists, the most important thing about a human being is that we are all unique, irreplaceable human beings. As an aspect of our unique destinies, personalists embrace the fundamental insight of the existentialists that all human beings are, to some extent, responsible for their self-definition. For the personalists, though, that self-definition doesn't consist of distinguishing oneself from the rest of humanity as a unique individual. Rather, a person actively creates the self through relationship with other persons in social and communal bonds. This form of personalism has been called existential personalism. Now, personalism, this basic idea, does a number of things in the work of developing the theory of complementarity. In a few minutes, I'll talk about where John Paul too takes this personalist insight that we define ourselves through relationship with others. But before I do that, I want us to think about the consequences of that basic existential insight that all humans are responsible to a certain extent for their own self-definition. This is what prevents a Catholic notion of complementarity from falling into biological determinism. The most common criticism of complementarity is that it is nothing but a rationalization used to perpetuate historic, outmoded gender stereotypes. Women could be seen as biologically best suited for motherhood and temperamentally best suited for raising children to the exclusion of all other vocations. Men could be seen as biologically best suited to father children and then leave them behind as they forge ahead in their leadership roles in industry, politics, and business. As Catholics, though, I would argue, we have to reject the notion of this sort of determinism because we never, ever underestimate the significance of God's gift to us of free will. In Dante's Divine Comedy, the canto at the very center of his pilgrimage from hell to heaven, the turning point, if you will, of this allegory of man's spiritual journey to salvation, contains that Lombard Marco's expression of frustrated disgust at the world's insistence that man is powerless in the face of the power of the spheres, the stars that are supposedly controlling his destiny. This is a couple of lines from the Mark Musa translation. You men on earth attribute everything to the sphere's influence alone, as if with some predestined plan they moved all things. If this were true, then our free will would be annihilated. It would not be just to render bliss for good or pain for evil. The spheres initiate our tendencies, not all of them. But even if they did, you have the light that shows you right from wrong. And your free will, which, though it may grow faint in its first struggles with the heavens, can still surmount all obstacles if nurtured well. You are free subjects of a greater power, a nobler nature that creates your mind, and over this the spheres have no control. The existentialist insight for the Catholic gender theory, illuminated by Dante's magnificent verse, is that while our bodies, our genders, may initiate our tendencies, they do not preordain what we do with those tendencies. We are responsible for what we do with them. The starting point for the differences between men and women is biological. We have different hormones, chromosomes, and anatomy, and those differences do affect how we perceive and how we interact with the world. We also all exist in a culture that has specific understandings of what masculine and feminine traits are. Each person, however, crafts his or her own identity by integrating particular parts of that cultural data with his or her physical starting point, the body. This integration is the work of our free will. Again, in the words of Sister Prudence Allen, free will decisions allow us to determine to some extent the kind of woman or man we want to be, even within the constraints of the socially constructed aspects of our identity. We can control certain aspects of our biology, and we can decide to incorporate or reject certain characteristics that our culture has identified as masculine or feminine, and we can decide how to interact as a man or a woman in relation to all these different aspects of our individual identity. And the important thing to realize is that this isn't some newfangled theory of women's liberation that tells us that we have this power. You know, it's a very Catholic notion with an ancient pedigree, free will. It's applied to another very Catholic notion with an ancient pedigree, hylomorphism. This, I believe, is the fundamental insight that existential personalism brings to a Catholic notion of complementarity. Now on to Pope John Paul II's theological contribution to complementarity. Integral versus fractional complementarity. This is where I get to the equation. Pope John Paul II studied under both one of the founding personalists, Emmanuel Monnier, and one of Husserl's students, Roman Ingarden. In his writings about women and men, both before and after becoming Pope, the influence of both phenomenology and personalism on his views of gender relations is very clear. From his own phenomenological Thomism, he takes a strong conviction that men's and women's lived experiences of their own bodies, as male or female, indelibly shape their identities in different ways. At the same time, though, he takes very seriously the personalist notion of self-definition, rejecting decisively the argument that nature determines a person's identity, as well as the personalist notion that this self-definition is realized through relationship with others. He adds definition to that relationship, characterizing the highest form of such a relationship as giving of oneself to another, indeed, as loving the other. In his 1988 apostolic letter on the dignity and vocation of women, Mulieris Dignitatem, he wrote, "Man, whether man or woman, is the only being among the creatures of the visible world that God the Creator has willed for its own sake. That creature is thus a person. Being a person means striving towards self-realization, which can only be achieved through a sincere gift of self." Prudence Allen identifies one particular development in John Paul II's understanding of complementarity as constituting a radical innovation for Catholic thinking on this topic. It is a theological rather than a philosophical insight, stemming from reflection on the fundamental theological truth with which I began my discussion of complementarity, the fact that we are all created in the image and likeness of God. Recall, our embodiment as different physical forms, as men or women, is supposed to be deliberate and instructional. The different ways that God chose to reflect His image in us reflect different aspects of God's image. So what aspect of God's image is reflected in this difference, in our embodiment, as two distinct genders? The Catholic notion of God is as a Trinity, consisting of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. One aspect of the God that humans were all created to reflect is God's nature as three separate entities. Allen argues that John Paul II's understanding of complementarity reflects, quote, a profoundly new understanding within the traditional teachings of the Church of the way in which men and women reflect the image of God. For the first time, we are being asked to consider the way in which the Trinity, as a communion of divine persons, is being reflected in our communities of human persons, and particularly in the complement relationship of woman and man. Allen suggests that this is what John Paul is referring to in this passage of Mulieris Dignitatem. The fact that man, created as man and woman in the image of God, means not only that each of them individually is like God as a rational and free being. It also means that man and woman, created as a unity of the two, in their common humanity, are called to live in a communion of love, and in this way to mirror in the world the communion of love that is in God, through which the three persons love each other in the intimate mystery of one divine life. For Allen, this insight is key to supporting the notion of complementarity as integral rather than fractional. The insight is what lies behind the equation in my title, that Sarah plus John does not equal 1 or even 2, but 3. Let me explain. Both fractional and integral complementarity share the two fundamental convictions defined earlier as the basic components of complementarity. And men and women are distinctly different, but fundamentally equal. A fractional complementarity would take the view that men and women each provide half of the insights, viewpoints, perceptions that constitute the whole of human possibility. Only together do we have a whole. This notion of complementarity can be represented by the mathematical equation 1/2 plus 1/2 equals 1. In contrast, integral complementarity argues that men and women are each whole, complete persons, integers, rather than fractions. When they enter into interpersonal relations, the effect is synergetic. Something happens in relationship that something more happens in relationship than parts of a person adding up to one whole person. Something new is generated. Integral complementarity, then, is represented by this mathematical formula that 1 + 1 = 3. The most obvious example of this synergetic effect would be the conception of a child, the three, by a man and a woman. But the same effect is possible in numerous other contexts. And here's another quote from Prudence Allen. When there is a good balance of sameness and difference among the persons who are bonded together for the other in an intellectual community, a political community, or a spiritual community, then a new fertile reality can emerge, which will be an analogous form of a new life. These can take many forms, such as a project, book, political reality, dynamic parish, and so forth. The fertile new life will always spring concretely from the persons bonding together in a specific community, just as a child emerges from the concrete context of his or her parents. So that, in a nutshell, is arguably, according to some of us Catholic feminists, a way to understand the history of complementarity in Catholic feminism. John Paul II, in his challenge to women to articulate and promote this new feminism, told us that its future is in our hands. If we are to embrace complementarity as a foundational concept, how do we do that? And what difference is it going to make? I'm just going to briefly discuss two important parts of the project about what we have to do. One of them is giving content to the particular gifts or geniuses of women versus men. And two, then, is taking seriously the integral notion of complementarity. And then I'll end with some observations about what difference that would make. Clearly, the concept of complementarity raises questions of what both the male and the female uniquely bring to the table. But since my topic tonight is feminism, I'm going to focus on the female side of the equation. Indeed, John Paul II clearly felt the need to spend much more energy articulating the particular genius of women than he did the genius of men. In Mulieris Dignitatem, he acknowledges forthrightly that women's genius has been historically suppressed by men as part of the effects of original sin and challenges us to rectify this. Quote, "The overcoming of this evil inheritance is, generation after generation, the task of every human being, whether woman or man." John Paul II got us started in attempting to articulate the genius of women in Mulieris Dignitatem. He explains that women have an innate and special sensitivity to the fact that humans exist to be loved. Women have a particular sensitivity to the fact that each and every human being is entrusted to each and every other human being, that we are all responsible for each other. Although both men and women have the responsibility, the same responsibility, to live their lives according to that truth, John Paul II argued that women have a special ability to appreciate this truth. He characterizes this special ability as a predisposition of women that can be developed more fully through physical experience of motherhood, but does not originate in the experience of motherhood or require physical motherhood for its full development. He claims that there are other ways that women who never become mothers physically can develop the same disposition, forms of spiritual motherhood. To avoid reducing John Paul II's notion of the genius of women to a caricature, though, I think it is absolutely crucial to understand that he decisively rejects biological determinism and that he sees the particular genius of women as very significantly an intellectual as well as an emotional gift. Although John Paul II's strong convictions about the importance of the family in preserving a healthy culture lead him to the equally strong conviction that the application of this feminine genius to the task of motherhood is one of the most important things a woman could ever do with her genius, he most emphatically does not reduce the feminine genius to any sort of a simplistic notion that women are better than men at taking care of children and other people in need of care. The heart of Mulieris Dignitatem, the central third of that apostolic letter, is devoted to a detailed analysis of Jesus Christ's relationships and conversations with the women in his life. In his analysis of these encounters and conversations, John Paul II points out that Jesus consistently engages these women on an intellectual level, sharing with them some of the most profound truths of his ministry before he shared them with his male disciples. This includes Jesus' very first statement of his full identity, made to Martha before any of the male disciples. "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" he asked her. And she responded, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are Christ, the Son of God." And of course, the very first person to affirm her belief in the Incarnation, even before Jesus articulated, was his mother Mary at the Annunciation. John Paul goes to great lengths in that beautiful letter to make clear that Jesus clearly appreciated the genius of women as something more complex than just the capacity for nurturing. It is both an intellectual and an emotional talent that helps some women understand some of the most profound truths of faith more quickly or more easily than some men. Now, we still have a lot of work to do in translating the general notion of being open to the idea that humans exist to be loved into something more concrete and something more profound than the sorts of women are better than men at psychology than math, right? Conclusions that are being drawn almost daily by scientists and social scientists. But there are actually a lot of women working on this, and the many ways in which Catholic feminists are going about giving content to the genius of women are very exciting. And they're very, very different from what you hear from traditional secular feminists. So keep your eyes open, join in on the conversation. It is great fun. But I have to admit, I don't think that defining or articulating the exact nature of the difference is nearly as important as allowing the differences to flourish. Which brings us to the second part of the project, taking seriously the integral notion of complementarity. John Paul II has told us that the special genius of women is critical to transforming culture to reflect the truth about the human person. He believes women have the special aptitude for understanding a particular aspect of what it means concretely and practically that every human being is created in the image of likeness of God and is equally loved by God. According to John Paul II in Centesimus Annus, this correct view of the human person is, quote, the main thread and the guiding principle of all the Church's social doctrine. All the Church's social doctrine. This is the entire body of church teachings on how man organizes himself in society, including such important concepts as the dignity of the human person, the preferential option for the poor, the dignity and the rights of the worker, solidarity, subsidiarity, stewardship, right? The unique female contribution to working out the concrete application of all these concepts is thus not something to be taken lightly. For this reason, although his strong convictions about the importance of family in preserving a healthy culture lead him to the equally strong conviction that the application of this feminine genius to the task of motherhood is one of the most important things a woman could ever do with her genius. He most emphatically does not argue that all women can afford to, or even should, limit the application of the feminine genius to the home, to the private sphere. From the very beginning of his pontificate, he has consistently and insistently challenged society to restructure social norms and workplaces to permit women's voices, including, but most emphatically not limited to the voices of women who are mothers, to be heard in the public as well as the private sphere. John Paul II understands that everyone has the obligation to work in some fashion, that everyone's work is part of our ongoing endeavor to create, here on earth, a society more fully reflecting the fundamental truth about the human person. In Laborem Exercens, he identified different men's and women's geniuses in how they work. He suggested that men's genius is most closely aligned with the objective sense of work, which he identifies as technology, while women's genius is more closely aligned with a subjective sense of work, the working human person. Both aspects of work are equally valuable in humanity's ongoing endeavor to continue God's task of creation by contributing to the dominion of the world. Indeed, that's why he argues that social structures and labor paradigms have to be rethought to enable men and women both to participate in the public sphere, not necessarily in paid jobs outside of the home, but in some form of public witness to the particular insights of each gender, without sacrificing the equally valuable work they do in raising children. Here are some of the concrete tips that he gives as to how the hitherto largely suppressed part of the equation of complementarity, women's particular genius, might make a difference in tackling some of the most pressing social issues of our time. In his 1995 letter to women, he noted the increased presence of working women in, quote, every area of life, social, economic, cultural, artistic, and political. In this way, you make an indispensable contribution to the growth of a culture which unites reason and feeling, to a model of life ever open to the sense of mystery, to the establishment of economic and political structures ever more worthy of humanity. He continued, women will increasingly play a part in the solution of the serious problems of our time, of the future. Leisure time, the quality of life, migration, social services, euthanasia, drugs, healthcare, the ecology, etc. In all these areas, a greater presence of woman in society will prove most valuable, for it will help to manifest the contradictions present when society is organized solely according to the criteria of efficiency and productivity. And it will force systems to be redesigned in a way that favors the processes of humanization which mark the civilization of love. He claimed in other places that women involved in education exhibit a kind of affective, cultural, spiritual motherhood which has inestimable value for the development of individuals and the future of society. And in an Angelus reflection in August of 1995, he said that, quote, the greater presence of business women in executive positions in the economy is giving it a new human inspiration and removing it from the recurring temptation of dull efficiency marked only by the laws of profit. I don't think we can ignore John Paul II's urgent call for all of us Catholic women, whether we are employed in jobs that pay us or not, whether we have responsibilities for caring for our loved ones or not, to also witness in some fashion in the public sphere to the truths that we are uniquely privileged to access. I believe that an honest reading of the teachings of John Paul II demonstrates that the Catholic notion of complementarity is based on an understanding of the feminine genius that has much more in common with many aspects of secular feminist visions of women than is often assumed. I also believe that the notion of integral rather than simply fractional complementarity provides a powerful argument for the need to address social inequities that continue to serve as obstacles to the full participation of women in the public sphere. For Catholics, the precepts of faith that underlie the idea of complementarity and the Trinitarian insights that underlie integral complementarity should provide even more robust motivation for fighting for necessary reforms to laws and social structure to overcome such obstacles. But what difference would it make, even if we believed this? Is there any evidence, it's just the mere presence of more of us women willing to participate in some way in the public sphere in a complementary way, that is, participate as women, not as imitations of men, but they really make a difference. And I want to point out 3 contemporary examples that I think suggest that it does. The first example is on many levels extremely tragic, and it is definitely an extreme. But it is true, and it illustrates a point. In September of this year, the country of Rwanda became the first one in the world in which women claimed a majority of the parliament, 56%, including the Speaker's chair. This doesn't entirely reflect the free will of the people. It reflects the reality that the past years of genocide and violence left Rwanda after 1994 with a population that was 70% female. And it also reflects the conscious, ambitious social engineering of President Paul Kagame, who pushed through a constitutional mandate that at least 30% of the parliamentary and cabinet seats go to women. But the population balance in Rwanda is recovering. Now it's around 55%. And the percentage of women in government significantly exceeds that constitutional mandate. And it has significant results. This is from an article in the Washington Post just a few weeks ago. One result is that Rwanda has banished archaic patriarchal laws that are still enforced in many African societies, such as those that prevent women from inheriting land. The legislature has passed bills aimed at ending domestic violence and child abuse, while a committee is now combing through the legal code to purge it of discriminatory laws. A Rwandan lawmaker explained the rationale. Quote, this was a broken society after the genocide. We made a decision that if Rwanda is going to survive, we have to have a change of heart as a society. Equality and reconciliation are the only option. It took women in the public sphere, women's voices in government, speaking in a complementary way, as women, not as imitations of men, to effect concrete changes to laws that are helping to heal that broken society. Now, fortunately, our society is clearly not broken in the same way that Rwanda's was. But our society isn't really fixed either, is it? The change of heart as a society that this Rwanda lawmaker suggests is made possible only by the presence of more women in government is certainly not that far removed from the redesigning of systems to favor the processes of humanization which mark the civilization of love that John Paul II claims require the greater presence of women in society. Second example. A few weeks ago, 2 researchers from the European Corporate Governance Institute in Brussels released their analysis of the effect of the presence of women on the corporate boards of directors. Apparently, according to their research on American corporations, having more women on corporate boards means corporate performance is monitored more closely. Women tend to show up more for board meetings, and they tend to volunteer to serve on monitoring committees more often than men. Now, the authors of the study, they concluded that overall this increased monitoring has a negative effect because it is counterproductive in firms that are run well. The negative effect of all those women on the board actually showing up for meetings, actually engaging in monitoring what their corporations are up to, appears to be particularly pronounced in firms with strong shareholder rights, negatively affecting market valuation and operating performance. How many of us these days are wondering exactly how well run the big financial firms have been? And how many of us are calling for more monitoring? And how many are wondering whether the shareholders' exclusive focus on profits is the best source of good corporate governance? Maybe John Paul II was onto something back in August of '95 when he said in that Angelus reflection, remember, quote, "The greater presence of business women in executive positions in the economy is giving it a new human inspiration and removing it from the recurring temptation of dull efficiency marked only by the laws of profit." Okay, now finally, here we are, the question. Does Sarah plus John equal 3, or was I really thinking of Sarah Palin and John McCain when I came up with that title, or were these just generic male and female names? If we believe everything I said above, it should make a difference if a presidential ticket contains a male and a female. In the abstract, if men and women are both supposed to be working together to address the social ills of the world, then we should believe Sarah plus John would give us 3. Does that mean, though, that this particular man and this particular woman should have been elected president and vice president of the United States? And that somehow, just by virtue of working together as a man and a woman, they would bring peace to Iraq, solve the world's financial crisis, and usher in the culture of life in the United States? Of course not. But the reaction to Sarah Palin's nomination does provide some lessons, I think, for both how difficult and how important the witness of a Catholic feminism based on complementarity is. There are obviously volumes to be written and hours of radio, TV, and internet bloggers' analysis yet to be endured by all of us, analyzing the Palin effect. But I just want to focus on one aspect of her complicated story. Whatever else Sarah Palin represented, I think we can all agree that she most definitely represented a woman putting herself out in the public sphere precisely as a woman, most particularly as a mother who had a contribution to make to the public conversation that would be distinct and distinctly valuable precisely because of this. In that respect, she was a paradigm of what I am suggesting for a Catholic feminist embracing integral complementarity. And this was clearly very, very problematic for many, many people. Shortly after her, for one thing, it accentuated her sexualization. Shortly after her nomination, I heard an analysis on NPR of the web searches people were doing of her. The researcher's point was mainly that there was an inordinate amount of interest in figuring out who she was. He caught my attention, though, with an offhand comment about how many of those searches were for things like Sarah Palin plus hot pictures. I'm sure that some of you were struck, as I was, by the articles on the mainstream internet news sites like CNN and Fox News, supposedly about the media coverage of Sarah Palin, in which the analysis in the text was patently an excuse to run a Photoshop picture of Governor Palin in a bikini toting a gun, right? Or that photograph of Governor Palin making a speech at a campaign rally in which the camera was focusing on a young male in the audience looking up at her, was framed by her 2 legs in their high heels. I'm sure that some of the tendencies of many women in the public sphere to dress, act, and talk like men are perfectly understandable defensive measures to preventing the inevitable sexualization that is an unfortunate reality in our broken world. And combating that, or figuring out the proper response to that, is going to be one of the most difficult challenges of new feminists who want to present themselves out in the public sphere precisely as women. Another challenge that was represented by her in putting herself out there precisely as a mother, and is in some senses, right, the mother of all mothers, staunchly pro-life in her witness with respect to both her oldest and her youngest child, her pregnant daughter and her son with Down syndrome. In appearing as a mother on the platform of the Republican convention, as someone with ambitions to the second highest office in this country, she broke so many barriers of people's preconceived notions about everything they could conceivably hold sacred that she became a fair game for criticism from almost every corner. I have a son with Down syndrome, so I'm on listservs for parents of children with Down syndrome, and I had to stop reading them because I thought my head was going to explode trying to keep track of who was criticizing her and why, even on that forum. They ranged from, how dare she presume to take away from others the choice she freely exercised to have her baby, to, how dare she call herself pro-life if she took the risk of amniocentesis. If, as a Catholic feminist, you insist on the importance of witnessing in the public sphere in a distinctly woman's voice, you will shatter preconceived notions about many, many categories of how one should live one's life, and you should be prepared for criticism from many unexpected and hurtful sources. At the same time, though, despite the fact that her witness does seem to have failed in many important respects, I think that it has also already had an astonishing impact on the culture of life in this country. I almost thought somebody must have been playing a joke when I read the following in a Washington Post article on October 24th. The unexpected recognition of a conservative as a role model for women has forced some traditional feminists to reconsider the movement's mission. It's going to take us a while to find our bearings, said Sarah Stosh, who runs the Planned Parenthood office that oversees Minnesota and the Dakotas. As feminists, we have always thought that a core aspect of women's equality is about being in control of our reproductive lives. But Sarah Palin is throwing the calculus out the window and demonstrating a view that some people would call feminism. I can be a governor, I can have 5 children, I can shoot and field dress a moose, and I don't need access to abortion. And this is extraordinary. There's a big debate inside the leadership of the women's movement about how much abortion should be a key political issue. Another quote from that article. It's just nonsense to say you can't be a feminist and be against abortion, said former Clinton fundraiser and supporter Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, who now backs McCain. Democrats use abortion as a noose around your neck, says de Rothschild, who herself is in favor of abortion rights. Sarah Palin, she said, rocks all the stereotypes of feminism and can only enhance progress for women. It's extraordinary. Debate inside the leadership of the women's movement about how much abortion should be a key political issue. That's progress. That's how we hope the complementary witness of women, as faithful Catholics, as women, not imitations of men, can indeed help to usher in the civilization of love and change the culture of death. Thank you.
Identify yourself, and as we don't have a lot of time, we must keep statements to a minimum. Ask a question and give Elizabeth a chance to answer. So please, let's start on this side. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the address. It was really wonderful. I just wanted to ask about, particularly in our situation in the United States, I found your title of Does Sarah plus John equal 3 very provocative. The question I have has to do with how much the complementarity in a normal workspace is able to be present, and whether or not maybe a different form of government would be better for explaining and promoting this real complementarity. The thing that I'm thinking of is Venerable Isabella of Spain. I mean, one of the greatest Catholic monarchs in the history of the world. She gave us a great example of true femininity as a queen of a country, but also working directly with her husband, who was the king. Just maybe a few comments on that.
I like our democratic system.
Right.
I think it works really well. But, you know, I don't know that I would be necessarily interested in a monarchy, but I do find something very intriguing in what you say, which is that I think that we're seeing in academia, and I myself have experienced this most of my professional life. I've worked at the same place that my husband's worked. I don't anymore, but I did for a long, long time. And there are some just extraordinary married couples who together can do a much better one job than either of them alone would be able to do. And I think that as we explore forms of job sharing, one of the things maybe we ought to reconsider is sort of anti-nepotism policies that make it difficult for us to conceive of a married couple together. We focus on the promises that might cause in the workplace. But I think there might be, in that instance, there might be, if we could sort of do, that's one of the cultural shifts, maybe we could think about shifts moving on. And it would also help when my husband and I shared work together, our work was much more blended with our family life. We could balance each other off and spell each other off much more than we can now. And so that might be a very intriguing thing to think about, which is that, you know, if it works, and if a woman is called to work outside the home too, and you have the same job as your husband, don't try to hide that, which I think is, or fight that. Maybe that is something that we could work with together. But I don't know how I couldn't force people to vote for the married couple, or, you know, so I don't know how I would really translate that into a form of government. But it's a really intriguing idea.
Yeah, the question more was the complementarity in marriage, not so much do we need to return to a monarchy. So, thank you very much.
Good.
Okay. I was very charmed by your wonderful presentation, and I'm all for the genius of women. I'm convinced I have a lot of genius myself, and I'm also belong to these women who do think that once we women get into things, everything goes better. But I do think it is important to keep in mind that complementarity, as you presented it, had a strongly egalitarian implication. And I think it's important to remember that if we want to avoid the suppression of women that has been happening for many centuries, there are two possibilities. One, an egalitarian complementarity, and two, the system of authority, which to me sounds more like a theological account. Why? You used the Holy Trinity as an example for a complementarity, but if I may say so, that's not quite complete, because the Holy Trinity stands in a monarchy. The Father is the one from whom everything starts. And even though we avoid the heresy of subordinationalism, nevertheless, we learn here that love happens among non-equals. In addition, when we just think of the way in which St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 11:7 reminds women of the fact that they were created for man's sake, second Genesis story, and that woman got her character as the glory of God, her image character, from man, then we are pointed into the direction to which this young gentleman just now pointed us. This is a theological concern I have, but I also have a practical concern. You know, I mean, in Germany, for example, we had a big investigation about why don't we reproduce. Women were asked of childbearing age, hey friends, why are you without child? An overwhelming majority said, well, there are just no men who are willing to start a family with us. So we have a very serious issue about how do we women manage with all our glorious genius, which I'm convinced, to remind men and to enable men to take the responsibility for a family. Plus,
there's a lot there. The Trinitarian issue, you know, I had to cut things. It's so complicated. I didn't begin to really understand the depths of that. I think so much more work needs to be done on that. And I think you're right. I think that in general, anybody who's interested sort of in these issues of authority too, there's a really wonderful little tiny book that I don't think it's in print anymore by a woman named Joyce Little on the church and the culture war, I think it's called. She has this incredible chapter in there about the difference in gender relations and in church sort of arguments about the difference between authority and power, how we translate that. So, you know, yeah, you're right about that. And on the practical issues, you know, I think it's really important to remember, I don't know, one of the lessons that I've learned in life is every single time I've made a decision on my career based on just doing whatever was good for my husband, it turned out better for me. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a gender-specific kind of thing, but that is, it's a point about marriage in general, of sometimes following for the common good. It's a place where I've had panels and discussions with secular feminists. I've had organized some things where I've tried to get secular feminists who are dependency or care feminists who agree with a lot of things that we Catholic feminists are saying to talk to Catholic feminists. The one place where the conversation always breaks down is when the Catholics, or people of faith, it's not always Catholics, start talking about the need to sacrifice, the need to subordinate your wishes to somebody else. That's where the conversation always breaks down. For us, it's, you know, we see it as a gift. It's the ultimate self-gift, but a lot of society cannot break through that barrier. So your points are very well taken there.
I'm Tristan Engelhardt. Though I'm from the Republic of Texas, I have a daughter in Alaska who has 5 sons and homeschools them. And so I have a connection. She considers herself a feminist by obeying her husband and raising her children. But that's not my point. I once had a Jesuit who's now the president of a Jesuit university. He told me, never deny, seldom affirm, always distinguish. It seems to me what we first need is to know what feminism is. Rosemary Tung, a well-known feminist, points out there's not one sense of feminism. There might not even be a genus of feminism, the species. There may just be family resemblances about a whole bunch of stuff. So out of all that confusion, we need a map. I mean, I don't think one can even talk about things without doing what the Jesuit said, distinguish. There may not be one feminism. Secondly, why, I'm an outsider. Why all this focus on modern philosophy? Why would a Christian ever do that? I mean, we have a church that goes back 2,000 years. Why not unite yourself with the mind of the original church and try to live in that to find what it is to be a man or a woman? But I'm just a philosopher who's too simple to be a theologian, but never would trust a philosopher to guide any theology.
The only reason that I had any guts to even try to begin to understand any of these modern philosophical currents that I talked to was because Pope John Paul the Great is my man, my hero, and he seems to have been influenced by them, so I was trying to figure him out a little bit better. But no, great points.
I'm Patrick Kane from Baylor University. You spoke a lot about the increasing role of women in public life and the ways they can express their particular genius in public life and develop that genius. You didn't speak so much about what effect that would have on the family. If you have if you have women entering public life in the model of Sarah Palin, for example, which is the model you used, what effect is that going to have on the family? So a simple question, I'd just like to get your response.
Well, that's the whole challenge that I think that John Paul II is posing to society so many times, which is that you have to change structures of workplace and structures of society to enable women to be able to have a public voice without negatively affecting their family. And I didn't go into that in great detail here. I've done it in some of my other writing. Certainly, if we try to have a public voice, given the current structures of workplace and social organization that we've got right now, it affects negatively our family lives. But some women don't have any choice about that, right? Some women do not have the choice but to have some kind of an outside job. Economically, that's the only option available to them. And so for them, we have to work on changing these structures. But more importantly than that, we need to change these structures to make it possible for the women who have some kind of a call to be also having some kind of a voice, to be able to do it without it negatively affecting their family. I don't think that very many women in centuries past have had a lot more time to spend with their families than the average woman who has a part-time or a full-time job outside the home today, because they had so much they were doing as well. I don't think the balance is actually that skewed. But since the Industrial Revolution, the way the workplace has organized itself, with the separation of stuff that goes on outside the home and inside the home, it's caused this really serious problem that we can't do both. And that's what we need to work at, to make it possible to do both. And again, I am not saying that women should all want to have paid jobs outside the home, especially with the structures of the workplace that we've got right now. The stuff they do in their family, with their family, is very incredible. Is the most important thing that they can be doing with their family. But it's not the only thing that sometimes we're called to do. The world needs us to be speaking in our distinct women's voices to change some of the things that are wrong, really very radically wrong in our society today.
Gilbert Meilander, thanks for a very interesting talk. If we had more time, I'd like to press on your understanding of Protestantism a little bit. Catherine McKinnon, as the intellectual heir of Martin Luther and John Calvin, I think we could work on the nuance.
Yeah, I know I could.
But I have a very simple question, though I think actually not unimportant, but just about sort of your way of talking in developing your thesis. If you're committed to the view that an understanding of complementarity requires that we understand that there's really something different between men and women, as men and women. They're equal in a sense, but something really different. I'm just wondering, and it's an honest wonder, why you use the language that has become a convention really only in the last quarter century or so of gender, rather than the language of sex. Gender is, after all, a social construction.
So I guess I don't have a better word to use, and
What's wrong with sex?
Nothing, really. No, I appreciate. I think that is a really important question, and one of the things that I honestly, sincerely meant this, that I didn't grow up. I grew up shying away from conventional feminist theory because I felt so out of home with it. Is that I'm woefully, ignorant in those, in how those two terms are used, really, and what that means. And it is something I do have to work on. I think it is a hugely important issue. I think that if you had a chance to hear Sarah Borden earlier today, she has a beautiful, nuanced way of thinking about those two and putting the two into an Aristotelian framework that I learned a lot from today already, and I hopefully will be able to continue to think about and engage in conversations with Sarah about that. But I, don't know it enough to do that well yet.
Hello, my name's Britton Snyder. I'm an undergraduate here. I just had a question. I think one of the biggest lies that young women of my generation have been told is that their career is most important in their life. And it's made them almost ashamed to aspire to be full-time stay-at-home mothers. So I was just going to ask, what do you suggest that young women should be taught, obviously in the family, but also growing up in schools, and what sort of social structures do you think can be established to help lead them to what is good and true according to their particular feminine vocation?
I think the most important thing is the most important social structure that has to be changed is the timeline of career development that works fine if you're a man who has a wife who will stay home and take care of your family. I think that I think there are two very important things that I would want to tell every young woman that talks to me about this. And one of them is that don't follow the timeline for your career that is being imposed upon you by so many of the constraints that we have out there. And then the corollary to that is to tell us older women that we have to change some of those structures. We have to get more part-time positions in. We have to make it possible for people to build their careers, if they have a career outside the home, around their family lives. That's hugely important. So tied in with that is to counsel patience and trust in God, that being told to slow down or to stop because you have a family commitment isn't the end to all of your all of the other. It isn't saying no to all the other vocations that you might be hearing yourself called to. But I would also say the same thing to men. I would like to say the same thing to men about their careers as well. The other thing that I think is really important. It's really important in this regard, and when I talked earlier in my talk about being privileged to be an academic, was a Catholic academic, because then my job is not just a job, it's a vocation, which is that if you have the luxury of choosing not to work, and you have a family, if you can afford not to work and you have a family, then the reason that you're spending your time away from your family really ought to be something that's a vocation, that's a calling for you. It really ought not to be able to afford the second car, the third home, or to advance a particular notion of ambition that you had just because you were very well educated. That's a hard thing to say sometimes, but that's something I would say as well.
Thank you.
People up here, but I'll discourage anybody else from So we're over to the man here.
Hi, I'm Jason Baxter, graduate student here at Notre Dame.
I don't think C.S. Lewis was a feminist, but he was sagacious. I think he said once that the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard was the sound of men laughing. And my question for you is, how does the complementarity model accommodate situations in which it seems that the mingling of the sexes actually poisons or destroys, I guess, the excellence of an institution? I'm thinking specifically, there's been a lot of talk about co-ed education and things like that, and how boys don't, in grade school, and I can attest to this as a former teacher of an all-boys school, don't seem to want to aspire because they see academic success as something that girls are doing well, so they don't even want to have anything to do for it. It just seems to me that there are certain situations in which to have all men or all women together is actually a joy, and complementarity would actually poison it. And I was just wondering what you would say to that.
Actually, one of the things that I've been sort of trying to think about how I could apply this and try to turn this into a law review article that's secular, not necessarily from a faith perspective, is thinking about maybe whether complementarity could lead to the opposite conclusion, which is that there's actually more justification for single-sex education if you take the notion of complementarity very seriously, because you do take incredibly seriously the differences between men and women in the ways that they think and they act. And if that's translated into a particular time in your life when you might think, act, or learn better if you were isolated from the other gender, I think complementarity would suggest that you ought to do that. You ought not to be afraid of that conclusion. So I actually have a pile of sort of cases on this same-sex education lawsuits sitting there waiting to be thought about in this exact same, to see if there's some way I could work with that on that. And my intuition is that it would lead me to conclude that it would actually support the same single-sex educational facilities.
My name is John Maratz. I'm from Austin, Texas. I have a daughter here as a sophomore and a son who's going to come. So I've had the advantage of seeing both a young man and a young woman growing up. I'm here because I'm the less important of my husband, my role. I'm the chief executive officer of a clinic. My wife is the medical director. She had to see patients. I was less important. I'm here. My point, may I suggest that we look at some heretical statements. Men matter. Complementarity is very interesting, but may I suggest to the young gentleman here that men can change diapers. There is nothing inherent in the chromosomal structure of a woman that makes her much more gifted at that. Dirty dishes can be done by men. And no, there is no national law that says you have to leave the paper first and that somebody else does the laundry. What I'm trying to point out, that the sublime is wonderful and that you gave a fabulous speech, but may I say that there is a rather pedestrian aspect of day-to-day work in the house. Men, do your work. Make sure that you help. If you have a woman who's intelligent, make sure she has time. And I'm here to tell you it can be done. The trick, can you change a diaper, number 2 diaper, with one hand? One. Test number 2, and I've done it in the early 90s. Can you bathe a boy and a girl in the same bathtub with 2 hands? Because your wife is on call. It can be done. It helps having rubber duckies. So what I'm trying to point out, the career of a woman in today's environment, which even in American society, it is not easy, period, is possible if there is truly a give and take. And no, an executive career, you can't have it all. Let me just tell you again, young guys, you cannot have it all. You cannot be on a path to be a CEO and be a perfect father and be a decent husband and be a member in the local committee. You cannot do that. I'm giving my age away. City slickers, what's the secret of life? It's one. And then, the fellow asked, what is it? He said, that's for you to find out. But it's one. So you need to decide what is important. In 95, my kids were 4 and 6. I got off the executive career track. You know what? It's possible. You have no idea how liberating it is to tell your boss, I don't want your job. Suddenly, the power balance is shifted. There is no carrot. You have no idea how empowering it is to be able to get out of an executive meeting and to tell people, I need to pick up my kids at 5. And it is possible. So go ahead. Go ahead and do your job, guys.
I applaud.
I'm on. I'm Anna Maria Scaparlina. I'm a 07 graduate of Notre Dame, and I had a similar question to his or his comment, and to Britton, I think was his name, question. Britton said one of the lies women have been told is that careers are more important than family. And I think that's true. I think that's also one of the lies we're all told, men and women. And you talked about restructuring society and mentioned part-time work and job sharing and things like that. And it seems to me, my father is a professor, as you know, but probably most people in the audience don't. So he could come to my JV basketball games at 3:30 in the afternoon. That meant he had to work after dinner, but he could still come. And that makes me never want to marry a man who has a regular 8 to 5 office job because I don't want my children to see my husband for 2 hours each evening and on Saturdays. So could you talk a little bit more about restructuring society, not just in terms of women being able to work and women being able to have tenure career, part-time jobs, but more in general? Thank you.
I think there's been a lot out there about how women, high-powered women that have the choice to, it's been in the New York Times and everything, high-powered women that have the choice to not work, choosing not to work and staying home, and there's been a lot of analysis of that, and some of the reasons is because they're finding these structures and this kind of life that we've got right now unsatisfactory. I think what's happening in they're being vocal about it or being sort of drummed out of them that that's actually why they're quitting, not because it's impossible, but they don't want that kind of a life. I think one of the things that's happening is that they're articulating it and men are hearing it. I think that's exactly one of the things we need to be doing, witnessing the structure of workplace and that we've developed in the United States really over the past couple of decades, most emphatically, but not just in the United States. It's wrong for everybody. It doesn't work for everybody. I think we have to be the pioneers, the leaders, the prophets in making that clear. Now that we have the choice, the training to take those jobs and we're rejecting them, I think a lot of young men are really taking that seriously and listening to that and saying, yeah, that's right. And the things that we are pioneering and pushing for, like part-time, job sharing, going totally out of the workforce and then maybe coming back when it's possible for our family to be taken care of, I think men are taking notice, and we just need to encourage that. I think good things are happening in that regard.
You're in luck because I had precisely the same question. So I want to say that it was a terrific talk, and as somebody that's been immersed in secular feminism at UC Berkeley for the last 10 years, I found it quite convincing and very exciting. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And David Solomon thought it would be very appropriate that my being an Australian that the announcement come from me. There will be a reception afterwards, right outside here, and David thought I should say, not only beer and wine will be available, but I guess hard liquor. I thought it was a little into stereotypes myself. I want to say that there will be a reception and there'll be a drink suitable for men and women. My final task is to thank our speaker. I feel pretty confident that Zach Schuster would be delighted with this evening, which I think the questions indicate how stimulating what Elizabeth has given us has been, how much food for thought, but also how much work to be done. Please thank Elizabeth.